Go live, and we are live. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening, good evening, as Mr. James Spann would say. We're back in the Weather Center yet again here in the home office. It is 8:16. I was about 45 seconds late. I do apologize. On April 5th, 2025. We have the latest on our European seasonal outlook that now extends through the month of October, and we're going to break all of that down. But before we get started, I want to say good evening to everybody who is joining us today. I was kind of stuck here looking at some of the Colorado State University analogs, and to tell you the truth, they don't quite add up to me. For example, I have 1999 pulled up right now, and while I do see a bit of that eastern tropical Atlantic cool signal, I don't see any of this out there. We have an enormous cool northeastern Pacific, west coast of United States, and a strong dominating La Nina all the way down to the southern fringes of South America. This is one of their analogs, and to tell you the truth, I'm kind of thrown off. This doesn't look anything close to the configuration we have out there right now. And in fact, all this anomalous cooling out here across much of the eastern half of the Pacific would suggest that our atmosphere is more than poised to produce an active hurricane season, but that doesn't line up at all with what we're seeing out there right now. The same thing if I were to go over to 2006, switch us to 2006 on the climate reanalysis model here. This looks a bit more reminiscent, kind of, sort of, but then it also shows an above-average MDR in the tropical Atlantic extending through the Lesser Antilles with cooler subtropics. So that's kind of a reversal of the configuration we're seeing right now. The same thing with 2011. If anything, 2012 might be a bit of a more favorable analog. You look at 2011, again, a rockin' La Nina out there and a negative Pacific decadal oscillation in the northern half of the Pacific Ocean and a warm MDR. You switch to 2012, however, and you look at the average for that year, a lot more reminiscent of what we see right now. We have a bit of that warmth confined to the mid-latitudes in the subtropics, a little bit of an Atlantic Nina going on with a average, if not just barely below average, eastern tropical Atlantic, and our fading La Nina out there with a bit of a Costeros El Nino forming up. So I don't know. Their analogs, they're kind of throwing me for a curve. I have to reread their discussion again to see what it is that they're getting at, because they have plenty of La Nina years. I mean, shoot, at this point, I would take 2018 over everything else at this point. If you look, 2018 actually is a bit more reminiscent of what we have out there right now, with a lot of warmth in the North Pacific, very, very cold signal in the actual Atlantic tropics, but then we also have the diminishing La Nina. And we all know that 2018 is not the most favorable analog, especially if I switch us back over to the ONI index I have pulled up here. I mean, it could be coming out of a weak, moderate-ish La Nina to a neutral phase and in a weak El Nino if that were to transition the way that it does. But, I don't know. I'm definitely going to be investigating that quite a bit. Sorry, I'm looking at a text message right now. But once again, good evening, everybody. Enough of the rogue, what is it called, analogs. We're going to get started with the briefing now. So here's a look at the satellite. We always have to start here. Mr. Man JJ, Robbie Lynn McCrary, Dark Steve, Super Charas, everybody in the chat tonight. Good to see you. Kevin Rivera, great to see you as well. Samuel Reed, TG Herman, James Keene, Sabrina, Kevin, thanks for coming on over from the News 6 YouTube channel as well. Neighbors out there in Lakeland, Florida. I hope you got out to the Sun and Fun event out there, the Aerospace Expo that was going on. I kind of wish I had done that myself, but I didn't quite get around to it. So now let's get into the live data. We still have a pretty aggressive pattern shaped up over North America. I'll go ahead and draw it out for you all. We have a very large digging trough with a cold pocket that's working its way through the desert southwest, and then a dominant subtropical ridge centered just off of our eastern coastline here in the state of Florida, the mid-Atlantic coast as well. And that is why we have this large slew of training significant thunderstorms and flood conditions that are still ongoing for the central portions of the United States, from Dixie Alley, the Deep South, up through the Ohio, Mississippi valleys into the lower Midwestern states. That has not moved anywhere. it's just sitting there doing the most. It hasn't progressed at all, which is a bummer. We have some very severe flooding going on out there. We're still dealing with the tornadoes ongoing, the damaging straight line winds, and a lot of hail. In fact, the last time I had checked the radar, there were, I believe, 2 different potentially dangerous situation tornado warnings, PDS tornado warnings, which means confirmed damaging tornado moving into a populated area. Jennifer, good evening. Leslie, hello there. Austin, Dark Steve, the analogs do look a little weird, I'll tell you the truth. Definitely do look weird. Now, across the rest of us, we still have a very hot pattern in place for Florida, the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos. Right now, if you're in the mood to go cruising, do it now. Definitely book a last-second cruise, whether it be to the Bahamas or the Western Caribbean, because the Gulf, Bay of Campeche, down across the Central and Western Caribbean look spectacular. Puerto Rico, the Antilles, Hispaniola, Jamaica even, we're all chilling and sitting pretty out there. Going to be watching down here, though, as we go over the next 2 to 3 weeks. To tell you the truth, the ensembles are still thinking. They're still kind of giving us little whispers and murmurs that there could be some tropical action trying to show itself, whether it be in the form of just disturbances, large, broad areas of low pressure, whatever the case may be. I'm still seeing in the extended range CFS as well as the GEFS, the ensembles that go out 700-800 hours, that the beginning of May, very tail end of this month, April into early May, the East Pac may try to get going. And then you can see, of course, out in the MDR of the Atlantic Basin, we are quiet. Not a whole lot going on out there. So with that being said, let's get into all of our latest European model data. So right off the rip, we're going to start with ACE, because I do think that this is still fairly interesting. The European model, the seasonal outlook, kind of shows a fairly mute northern hemisphere. If I were to show you I will show you the forecast charts here in a second. A lot of our different tropical basins, whether it be out near the Maritimes, in the Indian Ocean, in the East Pac, and even here in the Atlantic, the Euro's just kind of a dud. It's really not showing too much. But then what's also interesting here is the European actually does favor the Atlantic for 120% of the average ACE, which means a 20% surplus in forecasted accumulated cyclone energy, with a bit of a, 1%, or not 1%, but about like a 1/10 standard deviation there. So it's still showing we're going to have an above-average season, but the rest of the numbers and the other graphical charts don't really line up. If you look, the Maritimes, they're looking at 70% of their average ACE, and then if you look at the East Pac all the way through the month of October now, since we're that far out, you can see we're looking at just below the 100% of the average ACE out there. So we're looking at a 20% surplus where we stand now between the start of our hurricane season through to the month of October. So I thought that was very interesting. That's one little nugget out there that already kind of stands out to me. Here is the latest in terms of our hurricane frequency. This is the forecasted total hurricanes for much of the hurricane season. At this point now, we're only missing November. We'll get November picked up by the time we get an update on May 5th. So Cinco de Mayo, we'll have our last round of preseason model data to look at, courtesy of the European model, and then we'll finally get a full consensus of how many named storms, what the total ACE looks like, how many tropical cyclones will go hurricane status, and where the general hotspots will be, which the hotspot chart even looks really bizarre. Not going to lie to you, the Euro is kind of just, it's a little weird. Not too sure what's going on there. But you see, for the Atlantic side, we're looking at 7 total hurricanes, looking at about 7 as well on the Eastern Pacific side, so nothing too crazy going on there. And then finally, last but certainly not least, of course, we're predicting about 14 total named storms on the Pacific side of the spectrum and about 16 named storms here in the Atlantic Basin. So again, we're at about a 3.6 surplus according to the model. So the European model for the months of June, July, August, September, and October, again, we're just missing the last 30-day stretch of the hurricane season in November, is forecasting 16 total named storms. So at this point, I think it's safe to say that the Euro is pretty much in line with what a lot of our other forecast entities are thinking about, 17 named storms for the whole entirety of the hurricane season, with that plus or minus 1 or 2 on either side. Could be a couple more, could be a couple less. This is where it gets a little bizarre, though. So if you look here at the tropical storm density through the hurricane season, it's not showing really anything out there. Nothing. across the Atlantic. And then it shows below the standard average for the Eastern Pacific, which doesn't make very much sense because then when I get into the actual El Nino Enzo predictions and the ensemble spread there, we're trending back into warmer territory. So I'm kind of at a loss to tell you the truth, folks. I thought we were going to have more concrete data, but the Euro is doing something funky. And if you look here, we have small clusters of reduced expected values for the Jacksonville area, the Georgia, South Carolina area, and then reduced expected values for where we have that cold bias in the Eastern Atlantic MDR. But then at the same time, it also has this entirety of the Atlantic plastered for usual expected value. So it's kind of going back and forth. Then you look at the East Pac, and it's also showing south of the Baja Peninsula to the north of where we typically get a lot of our tropical cyclone development in the Eastern Pacific side of the spectrum below average. So I don't know what's going on. You look in the Maritimes, well below average. You look in the Indian Ocean, below average with a small cluster actually inland over India. I'm not too sure what is happening here. This is definitely a night and day difference in comparison to last year. If I go to April of last year, there you can see big difference. Bam. Lots of expected action all the way up into the Gulf. Actually, as a matter of fact, it didn't do a bad job looking at this. The model didn't do bad at all. If we want to go back for verification purposes, it didn't do bad at all. But then if you notice, these designations right in through there are exactly the same. I wonder if that's like a graphical error or if that's just typically what the model shows. Let me go back to April 2025 real quick. I might have to do a little homework. Yeah, that doesn't change. So I'm wondering if that's just a general overlay. Yeah, you know what? I think this might be user error on my part. I think the model just naturally shows the usual expected value overlay there, and then it kind of pinpoints where it is that we are not likely to see any craziness going on during the hurricane season. So apologies. I'm going to have to do some background homework on this to better understand it myself. Didn't really realize that the usual expected value stays the same, I should say. Gosh, you can tell I have sleepy brain right now. But yeah, it looks like in terms of landfalls, last year it did fairly well. This upcoming hurricane season, it's predicting that Georgia and South Carolina may not get very much, and we're not going to have nearly as much development out over the eastern and central tropical Atlantic. So that's very interesting. Very interesting. And then here is your Enzo plume for the 3.4 region out there in the equatorial Pacific. You can see for duration of the hurricane season, kind of thinks it squeaks into a warm neutral, and then we crash back down towards just a general neutral as we go through August, September, and especially October, with some of those members spreading back towards the +1 Celsius anomaly, which would be a weak to moderate El Nino. We're still biasing the warm side, which, based on the research I've done in the background, that's typical of the European model this time of year. I'm pretty sure, as a matter of fact, let's see, did we have the same thing going on last year? Probably not. We were probably going into line. Even then, it still kept it kind of warm all the way through. And this is what actually took place. If you look, that black dotted line is what actually happened. So, is what I have to say to that. I still think we're seeing a bit of a warm bias, but the Euro is pretty sold on seeing a bit of a weak El Nino pop up, and I would imagine that the average will probably look something like this, if anything, as it continues to move along. We'll probably stay somewhere around warm neutral to neutral territory, and I'm very curious to see what our next round of Enzo models look like. So now let's get into some of the graphical products. Yes, please, as you hear it mentioned, hit that like button. Definitely hit that like button. This is where we're going to get into some of the meat and potatoes and talk a bit more about the theories that I have for this upcoming hurricane season. So first and foremost, this is April. April, we're already kind of not verifying. Because if you look, we're looking at above average precip anomalies through the Caribbean, but then if you recall going back to the satellite, we're dry as a bone out there. There's nothing going on. Granted, it is only April 5th, but still, we need to get something to spruce up the action out there if we're going to start to accumulate above average rainfall. And the only thing I can see in sight right now is near El Salvador, portions of southern Mexico. We got a little bit of daytime thunderstorms firing over what looks to be the higher terrain out there. That's not anywhere near above average precip, so I don't know. I think we have a bit of a rogue model in this case. It's kind of going a little haywire in my opinion. May looks active. May definitely looks a bit more like a gyre type setup. Like we're going to have the Central American gyre forming up thanks to our MJO coming across the equatorial regions down there. And it shows that trademark early season Eastern Gulf and then up towards the northeastern turn. So May could throw a couple surprises at us. And then if you look, there are very, very high precip anomalies down there on the eastern Pacific side where the monsoonal trough would be extending off of South America, south of Costa Rica and Panama. And then June, not a whole lot. Still actually shows the Gulf and Florida above average in precip anomalies. So either that means our thunderstorm season is going to be fantastic, or early hurricane season, we may already be holding on to our butts. It could go either way. I'm not really paying too much attention to these precip anomalies, though, because this just doesn't make sense to me. I really think the Euro is underestimating just how much warmth we have out there in the Gulf and in the Caribbean. I mean, if you look at this looks very El Nino, extremely El Nino. You'd have the strong wind shear coming right up out of the eastern Pacific, shearing apart any major thunderstorms. You're not going to have a lot of rainfall. This shows almost a drought-type setup for all of Central America, much of the Caribbean, all the way through Puerto Rico and into the Antilles with a dead main development region, a really weak easterly jet and tropical wave train coming off of Africa. I know that July really isn't the month to see that, but even then, this just doesn't quite sing it to me. This doesn't feel right. I don't think this is what's going to happen. You look at the month of August, and we've actually trended down in terms of our precip anomalies, but again, still seeing a good amount of a signal that stuff could just be flaring up very close to home. This could be a homegrown Central American gyre type season, or last-second rogue spin-ups like Milton, Helene, and Debbie, and so on and so forth. Francine, another example. Everything just kind of flaring up in the southeast and in the western extent of our basin. Then you get into September. Kind of the same thing. Nothing much out there over the main development region of the Atlantic. The Caribbean is still technically in a drought. According to this, very bizarre. I don't really see that happening, but hey, who am I? It just wouldn't make sense based off of what we've seen last year and the couple of years prior to. September, again, still favoring the precip down there in the southeast, and in October, again, it shows maybe a bit of an extension of our ITCZ moving through the Windward Islands, favoring low latitude, tracking tropical waves and precipitation. And then again, the Gulf, Florida. If you wanted to base all of your preseason forecasts strictly off the precip anomalies, I'm not going to do that. This is more or less just me having fun right now. But if you wanted to base the entirety of your preseason forecast off the Euro, you could make an argument that every single tropical cyclone is going to hit Florida. And obviously, please don't take that serious. If you're brand new to the channel, I promise I'm being sarcastic. I promise I'm being silly. But based off of every single chart here, if you look, above average precip for Florida, above average precip for Florida, the Gulf Coast, above average precip for Florida, the Florida Panhandle, above average precip for the Florida Panhandle, above average precip for Florida, above average precip for Florida, parts of Cuba, the Cayman Islands. I just do not see this happening. I don't see there being an entire drought across the Atlantic. And I think the reason why is when you switch over to our anomalies, the Euro is forecasting that just about the entire basin is going to start to cool off. Look at the Gulf, look at the western side of the Atlantic, and then look at the Caribbean. And then watch how everything just continues to really cool down. By October, we have all of our heat focused in the Gulf. According to the Euro, with now the main development region off of West Africa beginning to warm up a little bit. Something just doesn't quite seem right. I really don't want to use this as a big reference point. I really don't. I don't at all. And that's all we're going to say about that. This is also what I want us to look at very closely are going to be our height anomalies, upper level patterns, and then we'll take a look at the pressure patterns down at the surface because we're still seeing some interesting evolutions there. And truthfully, after what happened last hurricane season, I'm far more curious to look at our pressure gradient and the general wind flow across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, into the Gulf, and however else it decides to go from there. Because that's truly what dictates the season. You can have a tropical wave out there, and it's going to follow the 850, 700 millibar winds until it gets going. So these are your upper-level height anomalies for April, and then into May, June, July, notice you have a little bit more of that anomalous ridging up over Atlantic Canada, the northeastern United States. That's been kind of there every single update that we've had so far. This is August, September, with still a bit of an extension in our subtropical ridge extending up the eastern seaboard. And then October, we're kind of dominated by some pretty spectacular ridging, just flat ridging across the basin. So I think that's very interesting. And what really stuck out to like a sore thumb for me, let me get the toolbar out of the way, is our pressure anomalies. So if you look at where we are right now, we're in that positive NAO. This is going to be coming down as we go through the back end of April into May. We talked about that. And then you notice our Bermuda Azores high stays fairly strong. This is May, this is June, kind of a dead stick. And then July, we're suddenly pushing back towards the west again, hugging the east coast. Still there by the time we get into August, and then September, we're starting to see it kind of push back a little bit, but we still have overall high-pressure ridging across the Atlantic. The same thing with October. So what this would tell me is we're going to have pretty decent trade winds extending through the subtropics and the tropical Atlantic itself, which means if we don't have anything forming in the eastern or central MDR, they're going to move up like this. And then as someone just mentioned in the chat, will we have Irma-like tracks? Will we have westward moving systems that could try to escape into the Caribbean? I think so. Obviously, this is one model. We've already looked at a bunch of other parameters based off of this model that are fairly convoluted and don't make too much sense. But based on our pressure patterns and the upper level dynamics that we're seeing, especially for the month of August, you see our high pressure centered here, and we have a stronger extension of that out to the west. These would be your winds around the high pressure. So your tropical cyclones or your tropical waves are going to want to move generally like this, and then it comes to about maybe 60 west longitude, just like we talked about last year. That's going to be your definitive point of, is there going to be something coming off the United States to lift it to the north a la Ernesto, or is it going to continue towards the west like Beryl? Is it going to take a little bit longer to get going like Debbie, crash into the Greater Antilles, impact the Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas? That remains to be seen. We'll take that on a storm-by-storm, case-by-case basis. But all in all, the model is definitely showing us that we still have a lot to watch. We definitely still have a lot to watch as we go through the rest of the spring and get closer to the actual bona fide hurricane season. There's a lot of moving pieces, and what I think I'm going to be digging into over the next couple of weeks, or maybe the next couple of days, I'll say, considering we do have our NMME information that comes out in another 2 days. I'll probably do another stream for that on Monday or Tuesday, one of the days. We'll figure it out. And then we'll kind of just be back in a holding pattern and talking whatever else comes down the pike in terms of significant weather, severe weather, or, any other evolutions with our hurricane season predictions. I do have the hurricane conference coming up here very soon, so it's going to be very interesting to pick people's brains at that event. But yeah, before I open up the floor to questions, I just want to show you one more time one of the updated extended range GFS. So I'll bring us in for a closer look down over the Caribbean, the Gulf, and the East Pac. And if you go towards the back end of April, right there, it's been slowly but surely coming forward in time. We're now at about the 600 to 650 hour mark where the GFS starts to show areas of low pressure starting to pop off in the Eastern Pacific. And of course, we get our rogue members that try to form something down there in the Caribbean. I mean, look at that guy. There we go. That's the GFS that we know and love. Major hurricane by May 9th. Lock it in. That's it, folks. Hold on to your butts. We're going to be doing that by May 9th of 2025. Not really. I hope you're detecting the sarcasm out there. Once again, I just show this overlay to show you that we are getting closer in time. The Eastern Pacific, I think, is going to go first, and then we might see some crossover action if the pattern is favorable for it. There's always that potential for an early rising or an early riser out there in the Western Caribbean or the Southern Gulf. That would be our hotspot. And the biggest thing is we'll have to see what our MJO is doing and what our overall pattern looks like. This would kind of suggest, not really, never mind. I mean, no. Can't really, I'm not going to try to forecast a gyre off of that. That doesn't look very gyre-esque at all whatsoever. That's just your general wind shear anomaly. Yeah, no, I'm not going to try to forecast anything off of that. I'd rather look at an MJO time-lapse look that far out in time. Train spotter Florida, no worries. Mother Nature is mad about Gulf of Mexico's name change, so I bet she's going to be brewing in there mostly. We shall see. You never know. The euro is confusing me. I do agree as well. Silver Steel S. I think we have a lot of underestimations by the euro, and as a result, there's other meteorologists out there that are completely underestimating the season. Some folks are going as haphazardly to say we could be looking at a 60 to 90 ace hurricane season, and I'm like, I don't know about that. You guys are really hedging a lot of confidence in the early European model. Daddy Shark says, Naz, if we had to hedge our bets and take a guess at this point, are we looking at more of a northern Gulf or west coast of Florida setup this season, not barring west coast Florida threats for October? So personally, I still think we're looking at eastern Gulf, west coast of Florida type setup this hurricane season. Most definitely. Naz, I recently saw a chart with the percentage of potential impacts for the Caribbean. PR is at 48%. Is that a bad percentage? That depends, Kevin. Is that overall tropical cyclone activity, or is that the hurricane potential? Because I know that CSU releases a probability-based percentage breakdown like that, and they have it broken up into just general named storms, hurricanes, and then major hurricane. Top landfall, I personally am still thinking this portion of the Gulf, right about there, is where I think we're going to see a lot of landfalls. I think the Panhandle is going to get a good one this hurricane season. We could possibly see a return of the Ian Charlie type scenario where something tries to get into South Florida. And then I also still think we need to watch from Virginia and the northern periphery of South Carolina, maybe further up the eastern seaboard. If I had to kind of predict where we are right now, those would be my areas mainly worth watching. And then obviously Louisiana and Texas, they'd be my ranked number 2 area, just because if we start to get that gyre to spin, we could get something to slingshot up out of there, especially if we have a dominant ridge like in this picture right here that'll drive it into Mexico or southern Texas like we saw with Alberto, Beryl, and Chris last hurricane season. Oops, what did I do? Oh, there it goes. I don't know what just happened there. I feel like Cape Verde could really define the strongest hurricanes of this season. We shall see. We'll definitely have to see. And then, Leslie, don't sweat it too far out. I mean, don't sweat it this far out, I should say. I use those names because they're synonymous with coming into southwest Florida near the Keys, Sarasota, Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, Naples, Florida. That's what I'm envisioning, that we could see something either moving in like this, something moving in like this. But just because of the fact that it does look like we're going to have ebbing and flowing of the weakness in our high-pressure ridge over the western Atlantic and troughs extending off the United States, it's going to be a close call. That's why I'm thinking, from the boot tip of Louisiana through the Panhandle, Big Bend area, and up the mid-Atlantic coastline where it juts out like that, that is a kind of a repetitive pattern that we could see. It's kind of in here, too. If you look at not the ocean analysis, if you look at the analogs here, courtesy of Tropical Tidbits, and I'll zoom us on in very close based on what we have right now. If you look at a few of the analog tracks, a lot of them do try to take it up like this. You can see there we have a 1-track density there, a little bit of there, and then a little bit there. I think that's going to be the bias for this hurricane season, right in through there. That's what I'm thinking, right there. Which is very neutral ENSO-esque. If you look at the statistics and the tracks on every neutral ENSO pattern or season, we typically see this stuff hug the southeast and the east coast of the United States. I hate to say 2004, but 2004 is the first one that comes to mind. But even in, say, for instance, we'll take a look at a hurricane season like 2012. 2012, for example, is another hurricane season that kind of shows up as a bit of an analog. And if you look at the tracks here, we don't really get much into the Gulf outside of the eastern half from the boot of Louisiana through to Florida. Then the mid-Atlantic gets some stuff, and then there's a bunch of stuff out there that stays over the greater Atlantic. So I think 2012 is a pretty solid analog, despite I think we had a La Nina that hurricane season in 2021, a bit of a cool neutral to a weak La Nina. 2021 still looked fairly representative of what we have out there in the Atlantic right now, if I show you. Let me pull that up real quick. We'll go to 2021. If you look at 2021, I think another local analog, we have that cool tongue, that cool fetch over the Atlantic tropics. Most of our warmth is in the subtropics and the west side of the Atlantic, into the Caribbean and the Gulf, minus the cranking La Nina out there. Obviously, that's the big, kind of nail in the coffin here for making it a full-on analog. But 2021, I think, is another decent one to take into consideration at least. And this is another hurricane season where if you look, a lot of the storms, they biased from the tip of, let me change the color, from the tip of Louisiana and into the eastern Gulf. Lots of panhandle action. And then the mid-Atlantic you can see. And then more stuff out there in the greater Atlantic. We had one sloppy system that made it up into west, or I should say eastern Texas. Kind of like what I was saying earlier. If we get something to rogue spin up down here thanks to the gyre or some crossover energy, that's when Texas, Louisiana will have to watch closely. So, I don't know. I could see 2021 being, maybe a runner-up or an honorable mention in terms of analogs, just for the sake of the Atlantic, in terms of what the pressure patterns looked like and where we saw general formation. Hyrie Rama, that's a good question. That's mainly because we've had such a strong positive North Atlantic oscillation. We've had a negative PNA over much of the eastern United States for a period of time through the winter and then now into early spring. The negative PNA is kicking right now, and then couple that with a positive NAO where our high pressure here is now connecting with high pressure out there. We've got very strong trade winds moving across the Atlantic, and as a result, we're getting cooling, we're getting upwelling, very similar to what would happen with the La Nina out in the Pacific. We're getting upwelled waters out here, so all that warmth is being bullied off towards the west, which is why when you look at an SST anomaly chart, everything seems warmest the further west you go. All of our warm waters are now over here because the wind has displaced them. Those easterly trade winds has really displaced all the warmth and upwelled cool water out there over the Atlantic. We're expecting that to slow down as we go towards the middle and latter portions of spring and especially into the summertime. X-Florida, they're really not doing much of anything, to tell you the truth. They're just kind of ebbing and flowing right now. I've been looking at that, the sea surface temps for the Atlantic. They're kind of just sticking around. They're not doing very much in either substantial direction. But I am watching them. I'm watching them pretty much daily at this point. It's kind of like, working out. I have a bunch of people who can relate to that. You look at yourself too often and you think you look like garbage because you're used to seeing yourself. You're not really seeing progress. Although I'll admit, low-key, I feel like I'm getting fluffy in the midsection again. I got to get back to it. Is neutral Enzo worse for the Caribbean and Florida? Technically speaking, historically speaking, yeah, you could say yeah. And there's a paper that I love to refer back to, Neutral Enzo and Hurricane Season. There's a paper on here that I love to refer back to. Let's see if we can find it. Here we go. Meteorologist Brooks Garner out of Fox 35 in Orlando, he also shared some of the graphics on this. But if you look at what tends to happen during a neutral phase of the Atlantic, number of East Coast landfalling hurricane seasons per year, the green would indicate the neutral seasons, and you can see a lot of the neutral seasons, you don't get too much of the East Coast. Number of Florida landfalling hurricanes, if you notice, a lot of the green seems to edge out in this case, minus the one anomalous year in the mid-60s. We had more Florida landfalls during a La Nina. And then if you take a look at the general track tendencies during a neutral phase, there goes the mid-Atlantic, there goes East Coast of Florida. And then if you look all in all, with Florida landfalls, you get a ton of them during a neutral year. I do think Florida gets hit this year. I do think Florida is going to get hit this year. I really do. If I had to put a bet or place a preseason forecast, I'm going to say October. October is the one that gives me the warm and fuzzy this time. But I'm starting to wonder if we get something very sloppy and disgusting to come our way in the month of June. I wonder, based on what I'm seeing in some of our models. Yep, 2004 was indeed a neutral year with that Modoki El Nino out there. So it was like a warm, neutral phase hurricane season in 2004. That's why I personally, I'd put 2004 as a runner-up analog once again. I know a lot of folks are not going to like that, and a lot of Floridians would probably be like, you're just trying to freak everybody out and say, hold on to your butts. But if you look, we have a little bit of that warmth in the 3-4. We have some cooling, so a bit of a lopsided configuration. The CanSips thinks this could be a possible outcome. We have a warm Canary Current and some warmth trying to rebuild over the Atlantic with cooler waters in the Caribbean and just off the east coast of Florida. So not a perfect analog, but it does share some reminiscent phases. You can see the Indian Ocean dipole still in negative phase, the Atlantic Niña still kind of showing itself just off the southwest corner of the African Peninsula, the cooler anomalies trying to get up in there. We have the warmth in the subtropics and the mid-latitudes, and then we still have our negative PDO reverse horseshoe, albeit kind of diminishing off the west coast of North America. So again, not a perfect fit, but just something else to refer back to, especially when it comes to your pressure patterns. That's the key, I think. Especially when I come over to this, we'll plot the sea surface temperatures and take a closer look at the Atlantic itself, and then I'll switch this over to mean sea level pressure. And you think back on what the European model charts were showing, and wait for it, it's taking its sweet time. And there you go. Let me change off the I don't want the anomaly. The anomaly is just going to come up as a garbled image. There we go. This is what I was looking for. So you can see very sandwiched subtropical high out there. Very sandwiched subtropical high. And we can also go through different months at a time if you look here. Let me see. No, I want single. We'll go to the month of August. August was an infamous month for us in 2004. You can see Central Atlantic, we had the Bermuda Azores high. That's kind of what it is we're looking at for August and September. Same thing for September if I switch us over to that month, not October. September. Very similar to what the model is showing. This is kind of what gave, this is actually what gave us, this is a direct result of Francis and Jean, or this was a direct contributor, I should say, of the Francis and Jean setup. Weakened Bermuda Azores high allowed them to lift towards the north. You can honestly draw the tropical cyclone tracks here on the map. You can see it, bam, lifts to the north and then gets punched right into Florida there because of that little anticyclone up there, an extension. Roxanne, could you rephrase your question? How many times you seen Florida going to get hit multiple times? Are you saying how many times do I see Florida getting hit? Or how many times have I seen Florida get hit multiple times? Scrooge McDuck, welcome in. Yes, I can check the NAO real quick, and then I'm going to get started on wrapping up because I am definitely exhausted. It's been a very long day. I've been up since 1:30 this morning. So there's your NAO and the Euro ensemble. Here is the GEFS extended range. You can see a brief period of a positive NAO, and then we crash way down into a negative NAO as we get into the early portions of May, which is probably why some of our ensembles are trying to take moisture up and push it towards the northeast. Same thing with the Euro weeklies. You can see that we pretty much favor a neutral, if not negative, NAO as we go through the rest of April, much of May, and then June is on the immediate horizon. So, I mean, it could, the Tonga volcanic eruption, I can do a little research in that, but what Colorado State University is contributing to a lot of our warmth everywhere was the Super El Nino. Because of the Super El Nino, it kind of really shut down the overall Walker circulation for much of the northern hemisphere, which is generally what steers a lot of our doldrums that flow westerly in the mid-latitudes and then our easterly trade winds closer to the equator. It kind of slowed everything down because everything was just so hot. And now that we're slowly but surely, and see, that's why I think we could have a bit more. People are bashing the hurricane season saying, oh, it's cold out there. Everything's going to suck. We're not going to have anything. It's like we could possibly be putting ourselves back on a level playing field. And now that we're allowing things to cool off a little bit, because too much of a good thing turns into a bad thing, I always say, and that's with everything in life. Same thing with the atmosphere. I'm sure too much heat is just going to start to cause ruckus and jack things up. Wilma was in 2005, actually. Charlie, Francis, Jean, Ivan were in 2004. Wilma was in the back end of 2005, however. And 2005 is not a good analog for this hurricane season at all. At all. In fact, 2005 was arguably much better for 2024. Eastern Gulf Coast for Mobile. I would say Eastern Gulf for sure. Yes, less winds, less overall prevailing winds across much of the northern hemisphere. How many times do you see Florida getting hit in 2025? That is a question I do not want to answer. That is the trickiest question of all time, and I am definitely not that high of an accoladed tropical meteorologist to try to make that type of prediction. But do I see Florida getting hit? I do. I really do. About Southeast Florida and landfalls, that is something I'm going to have to research just a little bit more, because truthfully, we've been in the East Florida drought for a while now, especially Southeast Florida. Although folks seem to forget very quickly that we had Hurricane Nicole only 3 years ago. Hurricane Nicole 3 years ago. Make a goal. Oh, Gregory, you're very welcome. It's possible, George. It's very possible. I could definitely see Florida kind of getting another 2022 type of setup this hurricane season, to where we get something fairly sloppy, like a Nicole or an Alex or something like that, where it's mainly just a rainmaker. We get some wind, maybe a tornado warning or two, but it's just a lot of rain all at once. And then we get our real named storm in the form of a hurricane. Does a negative NAO cause cooling of the Atlantic? That's the opposite. A positive NAO, stronger pressure systems over the Atlantic, cause the upwelling. Negative NAO would allow things to just sit, simmer, and then eventually boil. Daddy Shark Naz, you help keep me sane on the buildup of these seasons. You are very much appreciated. You are very welcome. That's what I'm here for. There's always the possibility of seeing another Sandy. There is always that possibility. And I don't mean necessarily in the form of a track, but just the change that we saw that system go under. Technically speaking, you could kind of say that Milton was another Sandy. Hear me out. Obviously, we didn't have the snow and the extensive cold air intrusion into the cyclone, but because we were already undergoing that disconnection between a bona fide tropical system, we decoupled the low pressure, ingested a bunch of that dry polar air. That's what created the tornado outbreak as we were undergoing that extratropical transition, as it's called. They are. Train Spotter Florida, they really, really are. They are big time. And I think a lot of it has to do with what we had to endure last hurricane season. We were all sitting here like, it's going to go. We're going to have 700 named storms. And then it was a lot of folks would consider it just an above average season because we only had 18 named storms. 18 in my eyes is a lot. We had a lot of impacts. We had a lot of lives and damage lost, property lost last hurricane season. Milton did break a record. It's tied for the 4th most intense hurricane of all time, tied with Hurricane Rita of 2005. We have a negative NAO now. We don't have a negative NAO right now, or at least I don't think so. Oh, no, we do actually, yeah. So we have the negative NAO, but we're going to slowly transition back to a positive. And don't forget, we still have our negative PNA that's ongoing right now. It's starting to break down, and you can see that we're coming out of that negative NA or PNA. So slowly but surely, our trade winds across the Atlantic are going to slowly start to weaken. They're going to start to weaken. But as long as that's happening, or as long as we have winds coming off of Africa that are really helping to expedite the upwelling process, we're not going to see any substantial warming just yet. If I switch over to 850 millibar winds, and you look at currently, whenever this decides to load, there we go. You can see right in through here, we still have very good trade winds across the Atlantic. But slowly but surely, as we go through time, they're going to start to weaken. Yeah, look at that fetch of wind right off the east or the west coast of Africa. That is going to slowly start to go away. There you go. You can start to see the trade winds collapse with that breakdown or that little anticyclonic wave break that goes on. That squashes it. So we'll see what happens as we go towards the middle and latter portions of April especially. Yeah, Train Spotter for sure. And exactly, that's what I think it deals with. It's very psychological, this upcoming hurricane season. And there are some things that I agree with for the Euro, but not everything. I really do not agree whatsoever with those precip anomalies. I don't. I'm looking more so at just general steering and wind flow with that model. I think there's a couple things that still need to be adjusted for and accounted for that they'll hopefully start to accommodate as we go through May and then especially June. 850 millibars is where you're not going to have any type of friction or any substantial impact with anything that may be at ground level. And then on top of that, your pressure systems will typically create most of the general wind flow that causes upwelling and different things at the surface of the Earth between 925 and 700. Down at the surface, we're way too close. There are too many little ripples and bubbles and turbulent conditions and mixing that goes on. You have your boundary layer, you have your inversions, and so on and so forth. So you never want to look at the surface. 925 and especially 850, about 3,000 to 5,000 feet above ground level, that's where you typically look at your steering patterns and your wind currents, your wind belts, etc. You can see it the best. If I were to go down to the surface, watch what happens. Everything's all garbled. And even then, I mean, you can still see, because we're over the open water, there's not going to be as much frictional effects. You can still see how the winds are still cranking by this time at this point in April. And even before that, if I rewind, there you go. Look at all those easterly winds over the MDR. They're really cranking. That's what's helping to bully our winds and our warmer temps off towards the west. And there's that Atlantic high pressure. It's still hanging out there. That's going to be something to watch. That's definitely going to be something to watch, because even though the warmth is extravagant out there in the subtropics, that's keeping our subtropical ridge fairly dominant. I mean, look at that. That's a mid-amplitude ridge right there, right over the warmth in the subtropics. So that's going to be a common denominator this hurricane season, what that does. Yeah, exactly, Kevin. That's why we have all the different models in our tool belt. We like to look at them all. I like to look at them all. I'll even look at lesser-known models just for a sanity check, like the KMA, the JMA, the, what else is there? The Navy model, the Australian model. We have the Japan model. Or, yeah, obviously, we have the Japan GFS. We have the Spire model, Euro AI, etc. So, but alrighty. It is 9:02. We're going to call it quits. Oh, no, exactly. There's going to be things that we cannot account for during the season. For all we know, last hurricane season during August and most of September, we had just about everything in the cards and in the dominoes fall negatively for the hurricane season. We could possibly see the opposite this hurricane season. A lot of it does just naturally come down to sheer blind luck. If things naturally line up at the right time in the right place, you're going to have storms popping off regardless of what your overall configuration looks like. We can only do so much, and I personally think no matter how good we get at the science and no matter how good our computer models get, we're only going to be able to forecast from so far out with a level of accuracy and skill. There's just going to be things you're going to have to wait and see at a week, 2, 3 week time frame, etc. So that's all she wrote. Once again, I've seen the same question copied and pasted in the chat. We are under the negative NAO, but our wind flow out there is still behaving in a way that's pushing water towards the west and creating upwelling off the African coast. Plus, if I switch us over to the upper levels and we take a look at what our African easterly jet is doing in that general area, you can see that thing is still alive and well despite the time of the year. You can see it right in through here, helping to instigate even more of that mixing down to the low levels and providing us with the winds necessary to upwell the waters down there. And we have a very aggressive upper air pattern to the north here. You can see very dominant subtropical ridge, troughing here, which would suggest that we have very aggressive surface pressure features that are just going to continue to drive those easterlies across the Atlantic. Shoot, I'm sure we could go down to 925, and yeah, look at that. Look at all those easterly winds out there. Very powerful easterly winds all through there, and these are in knots as well. So we have about 25 to 30 knots of wind right over the MDR, and that's precisely why it is that we're seeing all that cooling. I mean, I won't say all that cooling, it's just we're cooler than what we normally are. But this is probably going to be going away. if you notice, that subtropical ridge finally begins to break down and those winds start to weaken. We got a bit of a neutral point out there. So time will tell. We're not even into summer just yet, so we got to give it a chance. There is technically a limit. And we can definitely get into that on a later date and time. But thank you all so much for joining in tonight. I got to go ahead and cut the live stream. I went much longer than I would have thought that I had gone. Gosh, we're almost approaching the hour mark again. I got to jump off of this. Hate to be somewhat abrupt, but if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop them in the comments section down below. If you're brand new to the channel, please consider clicking subscribe. We're just going to continue to pump out these content updates and these tropical updates and other weather updates for our AOR across the board as we continue to move through time, especially as we go through the rest of April, May, and then you know the time of the year once June 1st hits, that's when it'll be all hands on deck. So thank you all for watching. I hope you had a great first half of your weekend, and we will see you again probably on Monday or Tuesday once we get our last little cluster of climate data, the NMME, and then we'll kind of put it all together. Take a look at the CFS, the CANSIPS, the Euro, the NMME, and the JMA, I believe, should be updated as well as the Copernicus model. So we'll just take a look at everything and start to draw some conclusions for the month of April. And then I really got to start getting ready for the hurricane conference. So please feel free to hit that like button, nudge it a little bit, drop a comment, tickle the algorithm for me so we can get this channel back on par. And until next time, folks, have a beautiful rest of your night. But until then, this is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.